Sorry, you can't see me at the moment because there is some connection problem. But anyway, just before I start talking about the EAP, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Denis, and I am one of the EAP tutors in DIFC. Most teachers in DIFC have a couple of different roles. So, for example, I teach EAP, but also maybe I would do some tutorials. Maybe I might do EAP for special purposes. One of our main advantages in DIFC is that a lot of the teachers have experience across the program. So if you are doing IFY economics, you can be pretty sure that your teacher will have full EAP knowledge, but also some uh, uh, content knowledge, the same for science. So this morning, I'm just going to talk about one part of EAP that we usually run in the first semester. Okay, and this is going to be about the listening task. Okay, so I'll just start to share my slides. This morning, I want to talk a little bit about the listening task, and imagine if this was the first day that we were going to set about doing the task, and how would I approach it, and what would you as students have to do before we even begin the task. Okay, so as you all probably know already, EAP, or English for Academic Purposes, is usually broken down into the 4 skills, you know, so you will often talk about listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And these are the 4 main skills that you will need for EAP. Obviously, if you are concentrating on one of the skills, such as listening, for example, here I will be talking about the listening task, then the main focus is on that skill. But it's really, really important when you're doing EAP to remember that each of the skills do not exist in isolation. You know, so if I'm talking about listening, I want to focus on listening, but at the same time, we're also going to be doing reading, writing, speaking within that skill. So it's important once you start EAP to take that approach. I think that one skill does not exist isolation by itself. So we have to consider all of them. And then to complete any task, it's not just about the listening, reading, writing, speaking. There are lots of other skills you will need at the same time to complete a task. So, for example, things like critical thinking, you know, how to think for yourself. So you will be given ideas, but it's not enough just to take these ideas. You also have to think about them and put your own perspective on them. Another point that you might need to think about before you begin a listening task would be use of technology. You know, uploading documents, downloading documents, using audio files. If you know how to do these things, it will make the task a lot easier. And then another final part here is time management. You know, usually all of these tasks have a very definite time period. So you might be given 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but it's important that you learn to develop these skills. And part of the EAP program is to help you develop the skills that you need for university. So in each part of your EAP program at the IFC, what you will be doing is preparing different types of tasks, but the main focus is to learn skills. Okay, so earlier I said that listening might be the focus of a task, but that included with that, you will have reading, writing, and speaking. Sometimes, especially for students who are just beginning EAP, it's not clear how the skills are linked together. Okay, so what I want you to do now is to think about EAP, reading, listening, writing, speaking, and try to imagine how all of these are linked. Okay, so especially at the beginning of an EAP course, many students see reading, speaking, writing, and listening as separate entities. Okay, but actually, if you think about it, you will find, I think, that there are lots of connections between them. It's like one big grid. Okay, so I'd like you to take maybe about 1 minute, 2 minutes, just by yourself, to think about what kind of connections can I make between these reading, listening, writing, speaking. In other words, how do they go together? Okay, so just take 1 to 2 minutes in your own minds and think about it before we go on to the next part. And I will give you a chance to ask a question straight away. Okay, so you probably have your own ideas about what the links are. These are mine, you know, so I'm just going to show you my examples. I thought about how reading and writing are connected. So, for example, using research reading text to write essays. Sorry, can you turn off your, mute your microphone, people, because there's an awful lot of feedback. Thank you. That's great. Thanks. Okay, so for example, reading and writing, how can I connect them? Well, one example is I need to read text before I can write my essay. Another one is I can read text to develop critical thinking skills, which will challenge my own view and my own opinion. This is really important. Another example I made here was listening and speaking, how listening to lectures can start to prepare me for taking part in discussions and seminars. So this is the kind of work that you would have to be doing on an everyday basis in EAP in your DIFC classes. The main reason for this is because when you go to university now, these are exactly the kind of linking of skills that will be happening. Okay, so I'm going to go on now to start to talk about the listening task that I would like you to do if you were in my class. Before I do that, are there any questions you'd like to ask? You can ask over your microphone or maybe in the chat box. Any questions so far? Don't be shy.
Dennis, how many hours a day generally does the student get in EAP tutorial or classes?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's more, I would say, rather than per day, I would think about how many hours per week. Okay, on an IFY foundation course, if you were the student, you would have to do 6 hours of EAP per week. And then there is an extra 2 hours, which is EAP for special purposes, which essentially is EAP, but it's very, very focused on a subject. So for example, if I am a business student, then I would do 6 hours of EAP, general EAP, and then 2 hours maybe of EAP for economics. For example, if I was a medical student or a science student, I would do the same 6 hours of EAP general and then 2 hours of maybe EAP for biology. So it's rather than per day, it's more counted per week. Why we think it's important is that on your timetable, it will just say EAP. You know, it will not say EAP reading or EAP listening or EAP speaking. it will be EAP. So it's important that if you are coming to class, an EAP class, then you are thinking it's all the four components together. Because I know a lot of students who will have studied in high school, maybe their English classes have been very separated to this point, and maybe even a different teacher for each skill. So a reading teacher, a listening teacher. You know, once you get to EAP at this level, that's kind of over, and so all the classes are quite mixed.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? No. Okay, so I'll just move on. Okay, so this is an example of if we were starting our EAP classes of something that you would have to be doing. Okay, it's called a listening task, but remember we said listening never exists on its own. So first step would be, for example, you would do some pre-reading for a lecture. How would you do that? Well, you would search for relevant articles. Okay. Then you would listen to a lecture, you would take notes, and you would summarize those notes. You might write questions and links based on the lecture. Okay, now don't worry too much about these steps because I'm quickly going to jump to the next slide, because what's important focus of this short talk is how the skills are linked. So you can see here, if you are even doing just one task, first of all, you are reading, you know? So that's what you have to do at the beginning. You're searching for relevant articles, and then you might start writing straight away. You might write a brief summary of that reading text. So already, before you have done any listening, you are already using the two other skills. Okay, then you might listen to a lecture, you would take notes for that lecture, and then you would write a summary. Maybe after the end of writing the summary, you might prepare a presentation, which is a speaking skill, to work out exactly what did you hear in the lecture. So you can see here that one skill is never enough. You have to use the four of them all together. This is very good practice. This will also help you when you are doing your subjects, you know, so EAP and the subjects go together, but listening, reading, writing in your subject will help you, because remember, if you are studying economics or if you are studying physics, for example, not only do you have the EAP classes, but you also have obviously the lectures in the in the subjects. So this kind of development of skills will really help you when it comes to your content subject. Okay, so I have been very fast, obviously, and the information is coming quite quickly. But remember, you will be able to get a copy of our slides and look at this more closely when you have more time. Nerily will send them to you. Now, I'm just wondering, is there any more questions, or has anybody got a general question about EAP?
So Dennis, just when we talk about EAP, it is very language-based specific, but I get the impression it's also learning general study skills that you would utilize in university.
Yes, and this is really important. So EAP, you know, is called English for academic purposes, but it's not just that. You know, it's really, really important because when you go to first year in university, you can imagine the amount of time that you have to spend reading text. You know, you can imagine the amount of time that you have to spend listening to lectures. So one important part of doing EAP is helping you prepare for the level of content that you will get, you know. So listening to lectures, the ability to skim through lots and lots of text quickly to find out what's important and what's not important. All of these skills are actually really necessary before you go to university, because the pace of learning in university is so much faster than in high school. You know, it's a very different world. Like I said, things like time management skills, you know, in university, you will have assignments. The university professor is not really going to come around to your house looking for your assignment. You're going to have to know how to hand it in and when to hand it in. So the EAP, sometimes I think the word English gets confused in there, because it's not just language based, it's an awful lot about learning skills. And an awful lot of what you do in the EAP class is actually communicating with your classmates, you know? So, which for me, I think is one of the most important parts of being in a class. So you are actually using the language to communicate, and at the same time developing the skills and knowledge, you know. So the fact that you are now forced to communicate in the same language with your fellow students is a real bonus, especially in terms of preparing uh, for future studies.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Michelle. Okay, folks, I have to stop now because the next teacher, Stephen Easy Walsh, is coming in.